privileged to be invited to come and share here. And so, what did you say?
Are you teaching it?
I'm not teaching. I'm an academic scholar, a visitor. So I'm actually working on a book. I'm working on a book on apologetics. In fact, the two talks that I'm giving here are right in, out of my book. It's a book, 40 Questions on Apologetics, and wide-ranging on all kinds of issues, the sorts of things that I teach in my first apologetics class. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to put that together. And so I'm just kind of taking it all in and spending most of the time in the library or at my computer. I asked earlier, it is Veterans Day. Any veterans? All right, very good. Thank you for your service. That's awesome. Yes. My father-in-law lived with us the last 8 years of his life. He passed away about 2 years ago, but he was a veteran of the Navy. He served during World War II. Actually, he was on a boat that supported the D-Day efforts, and so he had lots of stories, and he was very proud of his service, and so that's great. All right, well let's get started. I want to talk about the question: is faith inferior to reason? I was smiling to myself that we're in a kid's room, right? I think that there's a lot of people that think, well, if you're going to talk about, Christianity and those sorts of things, you should be in the kids' room because if you're really an adult, you're going to talk about science or philosophy or something like that. But talking about faith is a juvenile effort, so we're in the right room. We'll see about that. What I'd like to do is mention a bunch of names and a bunch of other sorts of things as we get started, and then once we've laid some foundation about the objection and other sorts of things, then we'll try to talk about this question. So anyway, I forgot to do this morning, but if some of you are interested in checking out some of the things that I've written 2 little books that I have published on Kindle. One is called A Logical First Step. That's about logic. If some of you have always wanted to study logic and never really had a chance to do so, this is a kind of do-it-yourself primer on basic logic. And then the blue book is my brief guide to philosophy. It's actually all the handouts and things that I wrote over the years for my students on great philosophers and philosophical issues. And both of them are they're just Kindle books. You can't get a hard copy. Well, I guess you could if you ask, but they're Kindle books, and they're a few bucks. I try to make them inexpensive so that my students would buy them, so I don't have to make the handouts and give them out. So, but anyway, you might find those interesting. All right, let's get started. I want to begin with a story of a scholar, a man by the name of W.K. Clifford. He was a 19th century mathematician, and he made some advances in the study of mathematics, but he's mostly known for this article called The Ethics of Belief. And in this book, he argues in defense of a principle that we call Clifford's principle. And the principle is that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Clifford's principle. It is wrong for always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. And in support of this principle, he tells this story. And I've put some of the beginning of it here, but and then I'm just going to read the rest of the story. It's not that long, but it's too much for a slide. A ship owner. This was 19th century, so the language is a little old-fashioned, but it was like 1860, something like that. A ship owner was about to set to sea a cargo ship. He knew that she was old and not over well built at the first. She had seen many seas and climates and had often needed repairs. Doubts had been suggested to him that possibly she was not seaworthy. These doubts preyed upon his mind and made him unhappy. He thought perhaps he ought to have her thoroughly overhauled and refitted, even though this should put to him great expense. Before the ship sailed, however, he succeeded in overcoming these melancholy reflections. He said to himself, "She has gone safely through so many voyages and weathered so many storms that it was idle to suppose that she would not come safely home from this trip also." He would put his trust in Providence, which could hardly fail to protect all these unhappy families as they were leaving their fatherland to seek better times elsewhere. He would dismiss from his mind all ungenerous suspicions about the honesty of builders and contractors, and in such ways he acquired a sincere and comfortable conviction that his vessel was thoroughly safe and seaworthy. He watched her departure with a light heart and benevolent wishes for the success of the exiles in their strange new home to be. And he got his insurance money when she went down mid-ocean and told no tales. What shall we say of this ship owner? Surely this, that he was verily guilty of the deaths of all of those men. It is admitted that he did sincerely believe in the soundness of his ship, but the sincerity of his conviction can in no way help him, because he had no right to believe on such evidence as was before him. He acquired his belief not by honestly earning it in patient investigation, but by stifling his doubts. And although in the end he may have felt so sure about it that he could not think otherwise, yet inasmuch as he had knowingly and willingly worked himself into that frame of mind, he must be held responsible for it. Okay, so this is Clifford's position, right? That the ship owner is guilty because he knew that it was unworthy, but he chose to believe instead of anything else. So what's the moral of the story? Well, I think the moral is pretty clear. The moral runs along these lines. When faced with a hard decision or an intellectual conundrum, one can simply believe that everything will work out just fine, which amounts to having faith in God's providence. Or alternatively, one can employ reason to fix problems and to solve difficulties. The latter option is clearly superior, since faith amounts to a capitulation or moral surrender. Faith is intellectual suicide. I think that's the moral that Clifford would have us draw. Faith is intellectual suicide, whereas reason is doing one's duty to make sense of the world. Okay? That's what I think Clifford wants us to get, right? To just believe is intellectual suicide. Okay, faith is intellectual suicide. Clifford and many others like him hold to this sort of thesis, which I call, again, faith as intellectual suicide. It goes like this. The thesis that faith, and usually religious faith, we'll talk about that, is a poor substitute for knowledge. It eschews evidence, reason, and common sense. Faith is thought to be illusory or delusional or just a construct, just something we make up in our mind. Those who make decisions on the basis of faith are morally blameworthy, guilty of intellectual suicide. Faith is out of place in our modern world, and society would be better if it would just disappear. I'm sure that many of you have talked to people who have thought something like this, and by extension, therefore, those of us that have a Christian worldview, well, we are the, we're not doing our duty. We are the juveniles, whereas those that do reason are the adults. There are many people that hold versions of this intellectual suicide thesis, and I want to just briefly go through a few of those. Most of these names are people that are familiar to you, and ultimately, what I want to do is try to refute this faith as intellectual suicide thesis. I think that it's wrong-headed. I think it misunderstands what faith is. I think it misunderstands the relationship between faith and reason. And I think it misunderstands what faith offers us. So that's where we're headed. So some people that hold a version of the faith as intellectual suicide position are Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, of course, is the father of psychoanalysis. He was one of the leading intellectual giants of the first half of the 20th century. Not everybody agreed with him, but most people thought that he was an important and significant and innovative thinker who was doing important things. Freud held that all religious faith should be understood as illusions, which is a kind of error that grows out of our wishes. He called it wish fulfillment. Wish fulfillment is the process of reconstructing reality to match the good outcomes that we want. Here is a quote. He says, We shall tell ourselves that it would be very nice if there was a God who created the world and was a benevolent dictator, and if there were a moral order in the universe and an afterlife. But it's a very striking fact that all of this is exactly the way we are bound to wish it to be. And it would be more remarkable still if our wretched, ignorant, and downtrodden ancestors had succeeded in solving these difficult riddles of the universe. What Freud is saying is that the things that we want, it would just be an awful great convenience if the things that we really want, an afterlife, a God who loves us, who takes care of us, is the way it turns out to be. It's too good to be true. And so therefore, Freud says it's a kind of wish fulfillment. It's not the way things really are. Freud says, what is necessary is for us to grow up and embrace the hard truths of science, which reveals that there is no God and there is no afterlife. We should tell ourselves it would be very nice if there was a God who created the world and was a benevolent providence. But it's a striking fact that all this is exactly the way we are bound to wish it to be. It's like someone who believes that they will win the lottery, and so they buy all the lottery tickets, not knowing that the odds are so low that you're basically just wasting your money. Right? Freud also said in his another famous book, Civilization Its Discontents, the religions of mankind must be classified among the mass delusions. Okay? So if Freud is right, we're in rough shape. More 21st century, we have somebody like Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, of course, is no friend of Christianity and of theism. And his very famous passage in The God Delusion, he says that the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, vindictive, the whole list, right? He also says that he's trying to advocate for an alternative view, that any creative intelligence of sufficient complexity to design everything come to existence only as the end product of an extended process of gradual evolution. Dawkins seems to think that everything must have come about by the natural selection, not recognizing that God, if he exists, is eternal and not the product of evolution, but has no potential. He is what he is. So Dawkins thinks, therefore, that all of our Christian beliefs are delusional. In fact, Dawkins also thinks that when we teach our children about our religious beliefs, that we're really engaging in a kind of child abuse because we're teaching them delusional sorts of things. So, Richard Dawkins. Here we go. What is really pernicious is the practice of teaching children that faith is a virtue. Faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. Teaching children that unquestioned faith is a virtue primes them, given certain other ingredients that are not hard to come by to grow up into potentially lethal weapons for future jihads and crusades. So when you teach your kids to Sunday school, you're basically preparing them to be suicide bombers. That's Richard Dawkins' view. Okay, so another name that you may know, Sam Harris. Sam Harris is another one of the so-called new atheists. In his book, The End of Faith, came out around the same time. Harris holds that faith is epistemologically inferior, and it leads to intolerance and violence. Here's a couple of quotes from Harris. Tell a devout Christian that his wife is cheating on him or that frozen yogurt will make a man disappear, and he is likely to require as much evidence as anyone else, and to be persuaded only to the extent that you have given it. However, tell him that the book he keeps by his bed was written by an invisible deity who will punish him with fire for eternity if he fails to accept its every incredible claim about the universe, and he seems to require no evidence whatsoever. It's not how it works in my life, but anyway, that's what Sam Harris seems to think, that we as Christians, how we operate. Here's another one. Talking about Hebrews 11:1. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And Harris says, read the right way, this passage seems to render faith entirely self-justifying. Perhaps the very fact that one believes in something which has not yet come to pass, or for which one has no evidence, constitutes evidence for its actuality. He says, for instance, suppose I feel a rather thrilling conviction that Nicole Kidman is in love with me. As we have never met, my feeling is my only evidence of her infatuation. I reason thus. My feeling suggests that Nicole and I must have a special, even metaphysical connection. Otherwise, how could I have this feeling in the first place? And so on. So this is what he thinks faith is. He thinks that faith is entirely self-justifying and anathema of all evidence or reason or anything else. He says, the truth is, this is again Harris, the truth is that religious belief is simply unjustified belief in matters of ultimate concern. One last on this line. Steven Pinker. I read this book, Enlightenment Now. It's actually a fascinating book in a lot of ways. Pinker is a Harvard professor with lots of interests, everything from language and linguistics to science, and he's a firm believer in the ideals of the Enlightenment, particularly science, reason, and humanism in making this world a better place. In his chapter on reason, Pinker says, faith is believing something without a good reason. In some ways, this brief definition captures the essence of the faith as intellectual suicide thesis, that religious faith is inferior to reason and only leads to negative consequences. For Clifford, Freud, Dawkins, Pinker, right, they think that faith, particularly religious faith, has no place in contemporary society. Okay, so that's the faith as intellectual suicide perspective, okay? But you might be saying to yourself, well, what exactly are we talking about here? Is faith as self-justification or faith as something that requires no reason? Is that what faith really is? That's not what I think faith is. What is faith? Maybe we need a better definition. It turns out, and again, I'm going to go quickly, but faith, the idea of what faith is hotly debated in the history of Western philosophy and theology and these sorts of things. And I just want to give you a taste of some of these things. You might recognize some of these faces, right? Plato believed that belief is basically an opinion. Plato, in his dialogue called the Theaetetus, argued that when we have a belief, when we have a conviction about something, it's really just an opinion until we can show that it's knowledge by giving it, by showing that it's a justified true belief, right? The justification refers not to Galatian-style justification, right? But this epistemological justification in which we have warrants or reason why it's true. And then it has to be a justified true belief. And then it counts as knowledge. So Plato stands in the beginning of this long line of people that argue that for something to count as knowledge, it has to be justified. David Hume, he's the one in the spiffy orange jacket there. Hume seems to think that faith is a kind of confidence. That faith means that we hold something with a certain level of passion, a certain measure of conviction. That faith is when we really believe something. That's what faith is. William James, he's the kind of sour one there in the black and white picture. He's an American philosopher, and James argued that faith is actually an act. It's something that we do. It's an act of the will. It's something that we choose, the will to believe. Here's William James. And then down there with the hat and long beard, that's John Calvin. Calvin thought that faith is a kind of knowledge. He says, in the Institutes, he says, now we can agree on the right definition of faith when we say it is a firm and certain knowledge of the divine goodwill towards us based on the truth of the free promise in Christ and revealed to our minds and sealed in our hearts through the Holy Spirit. I don't necessarily completely agree with any of these accounts. I think there's something right about most of them, but I don't agree with all of them in total. And I think that the best understanding of faith goes in a bit of a different direction. It's interesting. You might say, well, what does the Bible have to say about these sorts of things? All right. Well, we could look at a verse like Hebrews 11:1, which I think Sam Harris kind of butchered. But in Hebrews 11:1 is a very important verse. It says, "For faith is being sure of what we hope for, of certain of what we do not see." We'll talk about this a little bit more. I tend to think that that Hebrews 11 is really more talking about one of the consequence or one of the effects of faith, but I don't think it's really a verse about what faith is. It looks like a definition. I don't think it really is, but more on that down the road. I think it's better actually to take a look at a verse like Genesis 15, in which is actually where Paul goes when he writes about the nature of faith in Romans and in Galatians. And Genesis 15, in verse 6, says, "And Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness." I think that the biblical account here of faith is more about exemplifying what faith is rather than describing it in a kind of theological, philosophical way. What did Abraham do? That's what faith, well, whatever Abraham did, that's what faith is. Okay? Here's what did he do? Here's what I think he did. I think that what Abraham did is he entrusted himself to God. This is my conviction about the nature of things here. I think that faith is fundamentally an act of trust. An act of trust. Faith is when we trust somebody. So I think Hebrews 1 tells us an effect of faith, but not necessarily what it is. Faith is an act of trust. It's a normal and universal human activity that is directed at people and things. Faith or trust is an essential part of life. So what do I mean that faith is trust? Well, that's a good question. One can have faith in God, as Abraham did, but one can also have faith in a spouse or a friend, a neighbor, so on. One can display faith in things, like in a bridge or an elevator. I was loafing earlier about the elevator here that makes a loud, disconcerting sound as it starts off. But I've ridden it now 3 times, and it seems to work. And but it's an act of faith, right? To get on the elevator, push the button, the doors close, and it lifts, right? And we've seen movies in which the elevators collapse, right? But and I suppose that's possible. But it's an act of faith to trust, right? The elevator will lift us off. I flew in from England earlier this week, right? Flying is also an act of faith. I pray a fair amount on airplanes when I'm not sleeping. I was sleeping more than praying this time because it was an overnight flight. And but it's that's an act of faith. And I think faith is an act of trust, I should say. I believe that my spouse will be faithful to my wedding vows. I believe that my friend gave me a good movie suggestion. I believe that this bridge will support the weight of my car. These are all acts of faith, and I think fundamentally they are a kind of trust. Paul Moser said that Abraham, he argues that the best way to understand Genesis 15:6 is that Abraham entrusted himself to God. And this wholehearted trust of giving oneself over completely to God, that's what faith is, and faith is a matter of trust. Okay? Now, it should be clear, I hope, from these statements that faith applies not just to religious contexts, but to everyday contexts. This because faith is a normal, universal human activity. It's something that we all do. You're seated in chairs. I think sitting down in a chair is an act of faith. You all probably had something to eat. That maybe some of you brought something with you, but right, if you popped open a can of soda or you ate a sandwich that you bought at a wherever, that's an act of faith. To just open it up and start eating away, right? You trust that it's safe and what you were expecting, that it tastes good, that it's nutritious, that it's not poisoned or something like that, right? These are all acts of faith. Let's go a little further. Faith and reason together. So I think that faith is an act of entrusting oneself to a person or thing that is deemed trustworthy. Okay? We've talked about some of these examples. Reason, on the other hand, I believe, is the process of acquiring knowledge on the basis of an empirical study. Examples include a historical study, a medical research, or even just driving around until you find the coffee shop that you want, right? These are all a kind of empirical inquiry. They are trying to discover something for yourself. Let's see. Reason tends to be past or present oriented. That is, it works to establish what has already happened, as in a historical analysis, or that which is now shown to be the case, as when a new vaccine for a disease is developed. Faith, on the other hand, has an orientation towards the future. I think this is really interesting, right? So let me unpack this a little bit more, right? So a historian doing work to discover something, right, is going to examine maybe some primary text from the past, or take a look at maybe what other historians have said, or other ways to get back into the minds of the past, is looking for what was the case, okay, and that's important. And a medical researcher is trying to discover, a problem, a cure for a certain disease. And so she's, looking at, yes, what others have done, but she's also looking, doing her own study, looking through a microscope at this, or testing out various sorts of things, and taking a look at what this particular combination of chemicals and drugs does here, and what will help with this, and working together, right? These are past or present oriented. But faith is future oriented. We're going to talk a little bit about marriage as an act of faith, right? When two people stand up in front of the church or wherever they are and get married, they promise, right, to love each other and to be faithful and to support each other in sickness and health as long as we both shall live. Those are promises. It's future oriented, right? It's an act of faith because it's looking at what I'm going to do in the future. No one can know what the future is going to be. But faith is something that we do with an idea or the future, towards the future. Or what if you invest in a certain stock, or you sign a contract to go into business with somebody, or you begin an entrepreneurial effort, right? All of those are future oriented. They are all acts of faith. They are all things that you hope will occur. Does that mean that they are all necessarily inferior and ridiculous? No, I don't think so. So part of what is missed, I think, in the discussion of the faith as intellectual suicide debate is that faith is future-oriented, which means it operates in a very different way than reason does, which reason tends to be past-oriented or present-oriented. More on that, too, as we go forward. Here's another interesting distinction that I think is very helpful. This comes from philosophers. It's very common among philosophers to make a distinction between believe that and belief in. Sometimes the prepositions make all the difference, right? Belief that is intellectual assent. I believe that God exists, or I believe that Calcutta exists, or something like that, or I believe that there are penguins, right? It's just an intellectual assent. It's just that I agree intellectually that these things are the case, right? I might also say, I don't believe that Atlantis exists, or I don't believe that unicorns exist, or something like that. So I can either, and all believe that it's a matter of intellectual assent. But belief in is a stronger or a thicker kind of concept. Belief in is really a matter of trust. When I say that I believe in Jesus, it means that I trust him, and that I trust him wholeheartedly, right? If we turn to Matthew 22 and the greatest commandment, Jesus, the Pharisee came, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus said, this is Matthew 22:37. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." I think what Jesus is saying here is he says, you see these two believe that and believe in. I want you to take the believe in option, right? It's the weightiest, it's the thicker. I want you to completely entrust yourself to me, just as Abraham did, and Daniel and Moses and Ruth, right? All these heroes of the faith, Samuel. I want you to trust in me, Isaiah and Jeremiah, right? Believe in, right? Wholehearted. It's interesting. We actually have this distinction, the believe in, believe that distinction in the Bible. It's in the book of James. James chapter 2 and verse 19. James is talking about faith and works here, and he says, show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder, right? The demons, what's he talking about? Well, I think he means that the demons, they believe that there is a God. They know, right? They know that there's a God because they are spiritual beings. God is spiritual beings, right? The demons have observed God in whatever way spiritual beings observe things. But they don't have belief in. The demons have belief that. They know that there's a God, but they hate him, and they refuse to trust in him, and so they are devoted to the opposite. They don't trust in him. They don't love him with all their heart, mind, and soul. No, they despise God, and they don't trust in him. So this belief in is the stronger kind of faith that we as Christians are admonished to have. It's not just intellectual assent, it's something deeper. And so we could say that belief that is a kind of intellectual process, more or less like reason. Somebody might say, I believe in quarks, or I believe in quantum, mechanics, or I believe in black holes, something like that, right? That's intellectual assent. But you wouldn't say that you might say, I believe that those things are true, but you don't believe in them. Not in this way, right? Because belief in is to trust, to fully engage, to be 100% committed to. That's what Christian belief is. It's belief in. All right. So that lays some of the framework here for what I think faith is in trying to respond to the skeptics who say that faith is juvenile, that faith is intellectual suicide. I think that instead faith is something different. Faith is trust, and while his reason is trying to show that something is the case by an empirical inquiry. I will give you some time for some questions. Let me continue on and complete the lecture, then we'll give some time for some questions. I would like to hear what you have to think about these things. 4 reasons why I think that faith is not inferior to reason, or 4 reasons why I think the faith as intellectual suicide thesis is mistaken. Okay, first of all, and some of these we'll go back and repeat some of the things that I've already said, at least a little bit. First point, I think faith is indispensable, that it's necessary for life. I think that faith is something that we all do. Sam Harris and Freud and Pinker and all the others think that faith, we can do away with faith, but there is an everyday kind of faith that's indispensable for human activity. Our faith in God is a special version of that, but I think that the everyday kind of faith commitments that we make are indispensable. Without faith, we couldn't follow directions from a person or from our phones, right? Or fly on a plane, or take an elevator, or order food at a restaurant. When one realizes all the instances of trust in our lives, one realizes that faith is indispensable. Consider all the faith commitments that take place in an international travel, right? I just flew in from England earlier this week, so I was thinking about this, right? All the things that take place, not just the flying, but you have to book a flight, right? And hope that it's going to be all ready when you show up, right? That you have to arrange for the transportation to the airport. In my case, I had to wait for the bus to take us there. The checking a bag. Think about the faith commitment when you check a bag, hoping that you will see it again. Sometimes it doesn't work out so well, right? Eating the food on board, right? You didn't make it, but it was given to you. Is it good? So on. Trusting that we'll fly to the right city. Do you ever worry that the pilot will take you to the right city, right? It's a matter of trust. That your credit card will work to pay for the food or the snack that you get as you connect from one flight to the other. That the rental car will be there, that the hotel all these things are, acts of faith that are part of the process. You couldn't move from one country to the other, one continent to the other, without doing these kinds of things. Faith is an indispensable part of life. Now, again, religious faith is not the same as these. Okay, I get that, right? Trusting in God is not the same as trusting, in my hotel reservation or something like that, or trusting that my credit card will be accepted as payment for the food that I want to eat. But I think that they are versions of the same sort of thing. Let me put it this way. Religious faith is not the same as this broad everyday faith, but the general kind of faith helps prepare us for trusting in God and in Jesus for our salvation. It makes clear the truth that we can't take care of everything ourselves. See, the reason as discovering things on the basis of empirical investigations seems to suggest that I figured it all out myself, right? Remember Clifford's principle, right? And the ship owner that didn't do his due diligence to repair the ship, right? Clifford seems to suggest that he has to do it all himself. He has to take care of everything on his own. And I agree with Clifford that ship owner was liable. He was morally blameworthy of not repairing his ship. But that doesn't indict all faith commitments. That's just there's, as we will see, there are good acts of faith and faulty acts of faith. But I think that our general kinds of faith make clear that we can't take care of everything ourselves. The dynamic of faith as such is fundamental to life. Jerry Coyne is a professor of evolution at the University of Chicago, and he's written a book called Faith versus Fact, in which he objects to the point that religious faith is a species of everyday faith. He says instead that we are two different usages of the word faith, one religious and the other vernacular. But I think he's wrong. I think that if we believe that faith is a kind of trust, then I think there's a fundamental commonality. The faith that is involved in riding on an airplane or an elevator or in getting married is very much related to the faith that I have in God. The objects are different, and there's certain dynamics that are a little bit different, but it's still trust, and I think that's the basic idea. Clifford's principle, while it might initially sound very plausible, actually raises the bar too high. Clifford seems to suggest, right, he says, it's wrong everywhere, anywhere, for any person to believe something on insufficient evidence. But what exactly does he mean by insufficient evidence, and how do we know that it's insufficient? Right, these are things that he doesn't really address. And I think that, as we will see, there are opportunities for us to believe that are responsible. Actually, ironically, Clifford's principle itself isn't verifiable. It's self-refuting in that way. And secondly, responsible activity doesn't always require empirical justification. That's actually my second point. Or it leads to my second point. Number two, I think faith is distinct. It is not the same as reason. Faith and reason are different. They operate by different means, and so therefore they must be judged by different criteria. Faith, I think, includes an element of the mysterious, but that doesn't mean that it itself is entirely mysterious. Reason operates on the basis of an empirical investigation. The historian attempting to discover the origin of the idea of separation of church and state will examine documents to find the first time this expression is used. He may also look for earlier expositions of this similar idea to see the roots of the idea before the actual phrase. He might take a look at documents in philosophy or in political theory or in theology in an attempt to figure those things out. That's the empirical investigation. Think about Edison inventing the light bulb. right? He kept notes of what he did, and according to those notes, he tried about 1,600 different materials to serve as the filament. The filament is the thing that glows, so it's between the two poles, and when the electricity is on, he looked for something that would glow, and 1,600 failures until he found one that actually worked, right? That doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, right? This is empirical investigation until he found one that did. But faith doesn't work this way. Faith works by a kind of trust. When we see, here's I mentioned about Hebrews 11:1 earlier. It says that, let me read it again. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we see. Faith, I think, this refers to the effect. See, the interesting thing about trust, faith as trust, is that we don't know just how it's all going to turn out. But we deem the person we have faith in to be trustworthy, right? When somebody gets married, they don't know that their spouse will be faithful for the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. They trust that it will, but they can't know because it's in the future. It can't be known. So there's always an element of the unknown. But the author of the Hebrews says that when we trust in God, because God is the most trustworthy thing, those unknowns are mysterious, but we can have confidence because our confidence is in God. God is the most trustworthy. It's not self-justifying. It's not without any regard to evidence at all, but it's recognizing that we're trusting in that being who is the most trustworthy, namely God. And so, yes, there is a bit of unknown. Here's what we believe as Christians. We believe that Jesus will come back one day. We believe that we will go to heaven. We believe that there are mansions, right? That's what Jesus promised in John 14, right? Can we check those things out? Can we log on to the video feed from heaven to see how the mansion building project is coming along? We can't, right? Can't. There's always an element of the unknown in our faith. And that's just the nature of faith, right? If you trust in somebody to give you directions, or you trust in, that the soda that you just opened up is going to be fine, right? There's an element of the unknown. But that doesn't mean that it's irresponsible or wrong. It's just the nature of what faith is. 1 Corinthians 5, this is the passage where Paul says that we walk by faith, not by sight. Right? And I think Paul is hinting, he doesn't unpack it, he doesn't discuss it the way that I've been trying to, but I think he's reflecting the differences. When you walk by faith, you walk by trust, right? And what he means, he doesn't mean just walking from place to place, but the Christian walk, our lives, right? We live our lives by faith in the God who has promised, even if life is difficult, to bring us through to the end. But sight is by reason, only trusting in what we can know. Right? Paul is suggesting that we should work beyond what Clifford says. Yes? 2 Corinthians 5, wrong? Yes, thank you. I was wondering. 2 Corinthians 5:7, thank you. Yes, that's faith, and not by faith, not by sight, but by faith. Here's a little parable, a parable of my own here. Here we go. Let's put there they are. This couple. Imagine a young couple meeting the first day of college or university, and immediately kind of attraction, and pretty soon they are dating, and pretty quickly they are together all the time. Let's call them Mortimer and Gertrude. Okay, Mortimer and Gertrude. They're together all the time. Classes together, lunch, supper, right? Study in the library, right? They're together all the time. You just don't see one without the other. And let's just say that they're always together. And one day after supper, they head to the library, spread out their books to start working on their homework. And Mortimer says, "Gertrude, dear, tomorrow I'm going bowling with the guys, and so I'm not going to study with you." And she goes, "Oh, you are? Yep. I'm going to go hang out with the guys, so we won't study together tomorrow." "Oh, okay." So the next day, after supper, he says goodbye, and she goes back to her dorm room, where her roommate is surprised to see her, and the roommate says, "Why? What's going on? How come you're not in the library studying with Mortimer?" "Oh, he's bowling with the guys." "Oh, really? What do you mean by that? Well, haven't you seen the way Bertha has been looking at him? Let's just say. What are you talking about? And then they begin to have a long conversation about the flirtatious Bertha and looks and texts and other sorts of things. And then she says, how do you know that he's not out on a date with her? And they have another conversation. And after about 45 minutes of this, poor Gertrude, who was already feeling bad about not getting to study with her boyfriend, now was wondering if he has in fact lied to her. And the roommate says, well, there's something we could do. What's that? We could get in the car and drive down to the bowling alley, peek in the window, and see if Mortimer is there with the guys, or if he's not there, maybe he's on a date with the beautiful Bertha. So they talk about that for a while, and eventually they decide to get in the car, drive down. They go to the bowling alley, they peek in the window, and there's Mortimer with his buddies, bowling, drinking root beer, not anything worse, right? And no Bertha in sight. So this, I think, illustrates the difference, right? Because now Gertrude has what? She has knowledge, right? They've done their empirical investigation. They drove down, looked in the window, and they've seen him there. She has knowledge. What if she had chosen to stay at home and say, nope, I trust him? Then she would not have knowledge, she would have trust. And you might say, well, this sounds like, again, wouldn't it be better to have knowledge? Well, maybe, but trust is important too. Suppose that Gertrude and Mortimer sometime get married. And so every day, let's just say, Mortimer goes off to work. Is she going to drive down to work every day to check up, make sure that he is not having an affair or something like that, right? No, I mean, at some point, right, trust is necessary. And it's indispensable. And it's not the same. See, I don't think that faith and reason are the same sorts of thing. I think they are different, and I think that they work together. Okay, we'll come back to some of this. True faith is, I think, credible. It's not irrational or paradoxical. I don't think that there's any such thing as blind faith. That's, I think, what the Pinkers and the Harrises think. I think they believe that all faith is kind of blind faith. Blind faith might be in which you just take some action of faith, some kind of leap of faith without any kind of evidence at all. I'm not even sure I can even imagine what something like that is. Do you remember the Greek myth of Icarus? Icarus was the one who saw the birds flying and wanted to do so. So he made wings and used honey or something like that to glue them on. And his father said, don't fly too close to the sun. But he flew until he went to the sun and was waxed. The wax melted the wings and he, right? Or maybe a more contemporary example that might actually be better. Do you remember Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, right, in which he's following his father's journal to find the Holy Grail, and there's a place where he has to take the step of faith, and he says that he has to plunge over the canyon, and according to his senses, it's a long way down, and he's stepping to his death. But he trusts the journal and he leaps off. And what he can't see from his perspective is that there's actually a bridge right there. And in classic Indiana Jones fashion, he lands on the bridge, makes his way across, kills the bad guys, rescues the treasure, right, and everything else, right? That might be closer to a kind of blind faith. But I don't think there is. I think there's stupid faith, but not blind faith. What is stupid? Stupid faith is somebody who says, hey, will you invest $1 million? Sure, let's do it, right? That's stupid faith, right? But I don't think every act of faith is necessarily stupid. I think there are credible acts of faith. There's a story I like to tell of a briefcase, right? Let's imagine that I have a briefcase full of money. 50s, hundreds, thousands, whatever. I don't know, just stacked full of money. And let's say that it's also all moral and legally acquired, right? And I've got this briefcase or my backpack here full of money. And I and I have to go and do something. I can't take it with me. And so I asked Karen if she'll watch my briefcase, because she's been in my classes and I know her. And can you watch my briefcase for a couple hours while I do something? Sure, no problem. Well, then when it's time to go and I can't find her. And so I just look around and I see somebody, right? Looks like he's living on the street, kind of unshaven and dirty, pushing a shopping cart full of stuff. And I say, hey, buddy, can you watch my backpack? It's full of money. I'll be back in 4 hours. Sure, no problem. Now, is that a rational act of faith, right? Well, not necessarily, right? Because, this is a guy that clearly has money issues, right? And for him to hold on to this when he's got all kinds of things that he could do with it, I shouldn't be shocked if I come back a few hours later and he's gone, right? But the point is that we need to trust. And if I need to put my money, under my bed or in a bank or with a friend or invest it, right, it's still an act of trust. But there are more rational acts of trust than others. And so I think that just thinking that faith is irrational fails to understand the distinction, right? There is stupid faith. There may be blind faith. I don't know about that. But I think there's also credible, rational faith. There are things that we do that are responsible. See, some people think that Christian faith is a kind of fideism. Fideism comes from the Latin word fide, and fideism is the idea that faith and reason are opposed to each other. Interestingly, the skeptics, the Freuds and the Dawkins and the Harrises, they believe in fideism, but they believe that you should get rid of faith and only hold on to reason. In the Christian tradition, there are some that have said, get rid of reason and hold on to faith, right? There was Ignatius of Loyola, who started the Jesuits, said, I believe something because it is absurd. Soren Kierkegaard and Tertullian and some other people say things that sound fideistic. Even Martin Luther said one time, reason is a whore. And that sounds like a kind of a fideistic statement. I don't think any of them actually were, because I don't think fideism is actually something that you can really do. But the notion is that faith and reason are diametrically opposed, mutually exclusive, and you have to choose one or the other. I don't think that's the case. I think that faith and reason are distinct, but they actually work together. I think Christian faith is credible because it rests on historical evidences, philosophical arguments, scientific. Maybe rest is not the right word, but it's consistent with those, right? It's faith seeking understanding. They work together. And that's the last point here. Faith and reason work together, but they don't reduce to each other. I'm going to hurry a little bit here. Let's talk about Thomas Aquinas a little bit. Aquinas believed that faith and reason work together. He called it a twofold mode of faith. Some truths are consistent with reason, like the existence of God. Aquinas thought that the existence of God is something that you could demonstrate. I'm not quite sure I agree with him on that one. We talked about that this morning a little bit in my earlier talk. But Aquinas thought that the existence of God is something that can be established. But he also recognized there are some truths that we as Christians believe that are beyond reason, like the idea of the Trinity. And he thought that faith and reason were like two pillars that hold up a wall, right? Maybe one would be, certainly from a Christian perspective, faith is sufficient. But if we can add to our faith knowledge, then we have two distinct pillars that hold up our enterprise. And that's what we want. That's what we want. Faith and reason work together. I think that so in this case, faith uses reason, but I think reason also uses faith. Think about the medical researcher that's trying to discover a new vaccination. And she's doing, hard work, looking at different drugs and running tests and doing scientific experiments and other sorts of things. But she's also exercising quite a bit of trust. She's trusting in the work of others. She could do all her time replicating the work other people have done, but then she's not going to get any new work. So she's got to, at some point, say, I trust what the others have done. She's got to trust in her equipment, too. Is her equipment working, the microscopes and the computers and the scanners and all the things that she's using? She has to trust in her own cognitive faculties, her sensory. Are they working correctly? right? And so there's a lot of trust. I think faith and reason work together in that enterprise. It's interesting, there's a number of scientists who have recognized this as well, that scientists need to have faith in the regularity of nature. They can't do science unless they believe that the way the scientific world operates, the physical world operates, is regular and repeatable. It's not something they can prove or even explain, but it's necessary for them to do science. And so a number of scientists like John Polkinghorne and others have said science rests on faith. They work together. Faith and reason work together. Let me, yeah, I'm running out of time. These conversion stories are interesting. Let's just take one simple one. Let's just take Lee Strobel's. Some of you know this story. Strobel was a journalist in Chicago. He had an Ivy League education, and he was quite good at his job. And he was a hard-nosed investigator and journalist. And then his wife became a Christian. And he wasn't happy because that meant that their lives were going to change. And so, but he said, the only way I'm going to talk her out of this is if I can show to her, prove to her that Christianity isn't true. So he used all of his investigative skills to start researching Christianity. And the more he researched, he found it was a lot harder to disprove than he thought. And the more he kept researching it, he discovered, well, that's true. Oh, that's true. Well, that's true. And eventually he became a Christian and an apologist, right? And so he's still saved by faith, as we all are, but his faith rested on, or at least was reinforced by, the reasoned investigation that he did. Faith and reason work together to produce, and all of these people, whether it's C.S. Lewis, Pandita Ramabai, Nabil Qureshi, their experience of becoming a Christian is informed by faith and reason together. Let me close with just this last point. Because there's something I haven't yet mentioned about faith, which is really important. And that is that faith inclines us towards something that is bigger than ourselves. From a theological perspective, not specifically thinking about religious faith, faith introduces us to something more. Let me put it this way. Faith connects us with something that is bigger than ourselves. See, reason is a kind of a master, right? If you have reasoned your way through a chemical equation or a historical process or medical research or something, or Edison trying to find something that will make a light bulb, right? You work your way through all those things and you're a master. You've figured it out. It's demonstrated, it's established, it's shown to be the case. Reason lays it all out, and then the conclusions follow, right? It follows along because you're the master. You've figured it all out. I know it. But faith is much more of a submissive or even a kind of a surrender. Faith looks up and recognizes there's something bigger than what I am. Faith acknowledges there's something more, something transcendent. See, faith is very consistent with wonder, with awe, with a recognition of something that is more than myself. It recognizes I don't have it all figured out, but I need this person. And so faith is an attitude towards the transcendent. If reason is looking down on what has been established, faith is looking up to what can't be grasped, but is absolutely necessary. Faith realizes there's more than what we can know. There is something, God, that lies outside of our grasp. And faith is embracing that one as true and trustworthy. I think that's what faith does that reason can't do. And it's one of the reasons why faith is so necessary in our world. Thank you very much. All right, I said I would take some time for questions. I know that we have, but is the next session started at quarter after? 10 after. Oh, gosh. So, okay, maybe one or two questions. I'm sorry. If you need to leave, that's fine. But if you have a question, I would love to answer any queries you might have. Yes, please.
I'm not a scientist, but my husband is a science person, and it seems like the discoveries on the quantum level even give us insight into how a belief in the Trinity is not irrational.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
There's so many things, reasons to believe
Yes.
that keep coming out.
Yes, because the and the quantum stuff is all very difficult, but it suggests that it's not quite everything's not just quite as cut and dried as reason makes it to be. Right? For instance, part of the quantum understanding is that there's that light is both a particle and a wave. Those are two different things, and it should be one or the other, and yet it's both, and that doesn't make any sense. And so those sorts of things that seem to violate the principle of non-contradiction help us to see that when we as Christians have faith in a God who is three and one at the same time, we're not doing something that is so irresponsible, but we're recognizing that there is wonder and mystery in our world that is more than we can understand, and that's okay because we are finite and there are beings that are above us.
And the physical nature of things, when you look at quantum mechanics, what we consider to be physical solid is just a whole other world.
Exactly.
So it is.
Exactly. Very good. Thank you. That's exactly right. Good. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate your attention. God bless you and all that you're doing.